The cards hit the table with a finality that would haunt Jack Merritt for the rest of his life. In one reckless moment, the cockiest gambler in Coyote Ridge had bet his freedom and lost it to three grinning ranchers who'd had enough of his swagger. Now he stood at the altar beside Evelyn Hart, the quietest woman in Arizona, bound by a wager he couldn't escape. But when her wild kiss finally shattered his walls, Jack realized he hadn't lost anything. He'd won everything he never knew he needed. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this tale travels. The desert heat made fools of honest men, but Jack Merritt had never claimed to be honest. He claimed to be lucky, which, in Coyote Ridge, Arizona, was worth more than virtue and twice as valuable as hard work. On the night that would ruin his life, or save it, depending on who told the story later, Jack sat at his usual corner table in the Lucky Dollar Saloon with a whiskey in one hand and destiny in the other. The cards felt right. They always did. "You boys sure you want to do this?" Jack drawled, his voice smooth as snake oil as he studied the three men across from him. Dust motes danced in the lamplight between them, and somewhere in the back of the saloon, a piano player murdered a melody that had been decent once. "I'd hate to take your money on a Saturday night. Your wives will have my head." Cyrus Blackwood, the oldest of the three ranchers, just smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who'd been backed into too many corners by Jack's winning streak and had finally found a way out. "Oh, we're sure," Cyrus said, his weathered hand steady on his own cards. Beside him, the Patterson brothers, twins who ran the biggest cattle operation within 50 miles, nodded in unison. "But we're not playing for money tonight, Merritt." Jack's fingers stilled on his whiskey glass. Around them, the saloon had gone quiet in that particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. Even the piano player had given up his assault on musical decency. "Not playing for money?" Jack repeated, his trademark grin flickering just slightly. "Then what the hell are we playing for?" "Your freedom," Cyrus said simply. The saloon's silence deepened. Jack could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every eye in the room settling on his shoulders like physical things. He should have stood up right then. Should have laughed it off, walked away, gone home to his rented room above the barber shop and slept off the whiskey burning through his veins. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and let his grin widen. "My freedom? Old man, you been out in the sun too long?" Thomas Patterson, the younger twin by 3 minutes, a fact he never let anyone forget, leaned forward. His eyes held none of his brother's usual humor. "We win. You marry the quietest woman in town. Proper marriage. Legal and binding. No running off after the ceremony." The saloon erupted. Men surged forward from their tables, drinks forgotten, drawn by the kind of drama that would be told and retold until it became legend. Jack heard voices overlapping, disbelieving, excited. "Did he say marry? The quietest woman. That's Evelyn Hart. He can't be serious. I'll put $5 on Jack refusing." But Jack wasn't laughing anymore. He stared at the three ranchers, trying to read their faces for the joke, for the catch, for anything that made sense. Marriage? They wanted him to marry someone? "You're out of your goddamn minds," he said, but his voice had lost its swagger. "Maybe," Cyrus agreed. "Or maybe we're just tired of watching you take everything you want from this town without ever giving anything back. You've been bleeding us dry at these tables for 2 years, Jack. You live high while decent men struggle. Time for you to know what responsibility feels like." "And if I win," Jack demanded, his pride stinging more than his common sense, "what do I get when I beat this insane bet?" The three men exchanged glances. Then Cyrus reached into his vest and pulled out a deed, yellowed with age but unmistakable. He laid it on the table between them like a challenge. "The old Hartley Ranch," Cyrus said, 200 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, 3 natural springs, timber rights, and mineral rights. Worth more than everything in your pockets, on your back, and in your room combined. It's been in my family for 30 years. You win, it's yours free and clear." Jack's breath caught. The Hartley Ranch. He'd ridden past it a dozen times, had seen the way the grass grew green even in the worst drought, had noticed the way cattle grew fat on its pastures. 200 acres. A man could build an empire on land like that, could finally stop drifting, stop gambling, Stop proving something he could never quite name. All he had to do was win, and Jack Merritt never lost. "Deal," he said, the word falling from his lips before caution could catch it. Around them, the saloon exploded into chaos. Men shouted bets, slammed money on the bar, jostled for position. The bartender, Sal Murphy, just shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he watches a train heading for a broken bridge. Cyrus dealt the cards with steady hands. 5-card draw, nothing wild, no tricks, just pure poker, skill and luck balanced on a knife's edge. Jack watched each card fall, his confidence building with every flip. This was his element. This was what he did better than anything else in the world. First card, King of Spades. Jack kept his face neutral. Second card, King of Hearts. His pulse quickened slightly, but his expression never changed. Third card, 10 of Diamonds. Potential for a straight, but the kings were stronger. Fourth card, 10 of Clubs. 2-pair. Not bad, but not enough. Fifth card, King of Clubs. Jack's heart sang. 3 kings. 3 beautiful, powerful kings. He picked up his cards slowly, arranged them with casual grace, and glanced at the ranchers across from him. Their faces gave nothing away, but Jack had been reading men at cards since he was 14 years old. Cyrus had something good by the tiny tightening around his eyes, but nothing that could beat 3 kings. Probably. "I'll stand," Jack said. "No draw." Risky, but it would make them think he had something unbeatable. Sometimes the game was played more in the head than in the hand. Thomas Patterson frowned and drew 1 card. His brother drew 2. Cyrus Blackwood studied his hand for a long moment, then drew 1 card as well. The suspense stretched like taffy, sticky and uncomfortable. "Well?" Jack prompted, unable to keep a hint of his old swagger from creeping back into his voice. "What are we looking at, gentlemen?" Thomas laid down his cards first. 2-pair, aces, and 8s. His brother grimaced. 3 7s. Both looked at Cyrus, who was staring at his cards with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. The old rancher's jaw worked slowly, like he was chewing something tough. Then he looked up, met Jack's eyes, and smiled that terrible smile again. "Full house," Cyrus said quietly. "Jacks over 4s." The words didn't make sense at first. Jack heard them, but they seemed to be in the wrong order, in the wrong language. Full house. Jacks over 4s. That beat 3 kings. That beat everything he had. That meant he'd lost. "Show them," someone in the crowd demanded, and Cyrus obliged, spreading his cards face up on the table. 3 jacks grinned up like jesters, mocking Jack with their mirrored faces. 2 4s nestled beside them, innocent and damning. The saloon erupted. Men shouted, cursed, laughed. Money changed hands so fast it looked like a magic trick. Someone clapped Jack on the shoulder hard enough to rattle his teeth. The piano player started up again, this time with a wedding march that sounded like a funeral dirge. Jack just sat there, staring at the cards, waiting for reality to reassemble itself into something that made sense. This couldn't be happening. He didn't lose. He never lost. Not at cards, not at anything that mattered. But the cards on the table didn't care what he believed. They just lay there, immutable as death, real as the desert outside. "The quietest woman in town," Thomas Patterson said, and now his voice held something like pity. "That's Evelyn Hart, Jack. Samuel Hart's daughter. She works in her father's general store. Nice girl. 22 years old, never been courted that anyone knows of. Barely says 2 words together." "Why?" Jack managed to croak. His throat felt like he'd swallowed sand. "Why her?" Cyrus folded his winning hand carefully, sliding the cards together with precise movements. "Because a man like you needs to learn that silence has value, that quiet strength matters more than loud boasts, and because Evelyn Hart deserves better than a drunk cowhand or a passing drifter. She deserves someone who'll stay, even if it takes a bet to make him do it." "You can't force me to marry someone," Jack protested, but even as he said it, he knew it was hollow. A bet in Coyote Ridge was sacred. A man who welched on his word might as well ride out of town and never come back, because he'd have no life here anymore. No credit, no respect, no place, at any table that mattered. True enough, Cyrus agreed. You can refuse. You can walk away right now. But you'll walk away from everything, Jack. Every friend you think you have in this town, every game you've ever played, every cent of credit you've built up. You'll be a coward and a cheat, and that'll follow you everywhere from here to California. He paused. Let that sink in like poison. Or you can be a man of your word, marry the girl proper, and maybe learn something about yourself in the process. Jack's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his whiskey. The glass was empty. Everything was empty. When? He asked, the word barely a whisper. Week from today, Thomas said. Gives you time to make peace with it. Gives Miss Hart time to prepare. He stood, his brother rising with him. We'll spread the word. Congratulations, Jack. You're about to become a married man. They left together, Cyrus's deed tucked safely back in his vest. The deed that could have been Jack's empire, his future, his way out of the gambling life. Now it was just another reminder of the biggest loss of his life. The crowd around him slowly dispersed, men drifting back to their own tables, their own dramas. Within an hour, the Lucky Dollar Saloon looked almost normal again. But Jack stayed at his corner table, staring at the empty spot where the cards had been, trying to understand how his entire life had changed in the time it took to flip 5 pieces of painted paper. Sal Murphy eventually came over with a fresh bottle. He set it down without a word, sympathy and judgment mixed equally on his weathered face. For what it's worth, Sal said quietly, Evelyn Hart's a good woman. Better than you deserve, probably. But maybe that's the point. Jack didn't answer. He just poured whiskey into his glass and watched the amber liquid catch the lamplight. Somewhere in this town, Evelyn Hart was probably sleeping peacefully, completely unaware that her life was about to collide with his in the most absurd way imaginable. The quietest woman in town. God help them both. The next morning arrived with the subtlety of a hammer to the skull. Jack woke on the floor of his room, still wearing his clothes from the night before, his mouth tasting like something had died in it. Sunlight streamed through the single window with offensive brightness, and somewhere outside the town was already awake and bustling. For about 10 seconds, he thought maybe it had all been a nightmare, a whiskey-fueled fever dream that would fade with coffee and time. Then someone knocked on his door. Jack Merritt, a woman's voice called. You decent? Jack stumbled to his feet, nearly tripping over his own boots. He managed to get the door open and found himself facing Martha Brennan, the minister's wife and the unofficial town herald of everything that mattered, and most things that didn't. Mrs. Brennan, he managed, his voice like gravel. It's barely dawn. It's 9 a.m, she corrected primly, and we have wedding arrangements to discuss. The ceremony is in 6 days. So it was real. Of course it was real. Martha swept into his room without invitation, taking in the sparse furnishings, the unmade bed, the empty bottles with a single raised eyebrow that spoke volumes. She carried a leather-bound ledger under one arm and determination in every line of her posture. Now then, she said, settling herself on his only chair. You'll need a proper suit. Silas Brown, the tailor, can manage something respectable if we give him warning. You'll stand up straight at the ceremony, say your vows clearly, and not show up drunk. Are we clear? Jack just stared at her, still trying to process the fact that this was happening, actually happening. And Evelyn? He finally asked. Does she know? Martha's expression softened slightly. My husband informed Samuel Hart this morning. They're discussing it with Evelyn now, the poor girl. She shook her head. Never thought she'd be married off on account of a card game. But a bet's a bet, and your word is your word. Guilt twisted in Jack's gut, sharp and unexpected. He'd spent the entire night thinking about his own loss, his own humiliation. He hadn't spared more than a passing thought for the woman being forced into this arrangement with him. What's she like? He asked quietly. Martha considered the question, her fingers drumming on the ledger. Evelyn Hart is complicated. She's quiet, yes, but not because she has nothing to say. More like she's learned that silence serves her better than speech. Her mother died when she was 12. Since then, she's helped her father run the store, kept house, kept to herself mostly. She fixed Jack with a stern look. She's kind. She's capable. And she deserves far better than to be the butt of a cruel joke. This isn't a joke, Jack said, his own anger finally kindling. I didn't ask for this any more than she did. No, but you sat down at that table. You made that bet. You thought yourself so clever, so untouchable. Martha stood, smoothing her skirts. Well, Jack Merritt, you're touchable now. And for Evelyn's sake, I pray you'll find some decency buried under all that pride. She left, closing the door firmly behind her. Jack stood in the morning light, surrounded by the evidence of his small, directionless life, and wondered how the hell he was supposed to become a husband when he barely knew how to be a man. He avoided the general store for 3 days. Cowardice, pure and simple, though he dressed it up as giving her space or letting the dust settle. But Coyote Ridge was a small town, and eventually he ran out of places to hide. On the 4th day before the wedding, Jack's last clean shirt developed a button problem. He could have asked someone else to mend it. Could have worn it with the button missing, but something, maybe the first stirring of conscience he'd felt in years, made him walk toward Hart's General Store with the shirt folded over his arm. The store sat on Main Street, a squat adobe building with a wooden front that Samuel Hart kept freshly painted despite the dust storms that stripped everything bare every few months. A bell chimed as Jack pushed open the door, and the familiar smells of leather, tobacco, and dry goods washed over him. Samuel Hart stood behind the counter, a lean man with gray threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much disappointment to be surprised by more. He looked up at Jack's entrance, and his expression went carefully neutral. "Merritt," he said, his voice flat. "Mr. Hart." Jack approached the counter, hyper-aware of every creak his boots made on the wooden floor. "I need a button sewn on. Heard your daughter does mending work." It was a flimsy excuse, and they both knew it. Samuel's jaw tightened, but he turned toward the back room. "Evelyn," he called. "Customer for you." Silence, then soft footsteps. Jack's heart hammered stupidly against his ribs. He realized he was nervous, actually nervous, about meeting the woman he was supposed to marry in 3 days. The woman he'd never spoken to, barely noticed, had certainly never considered as anything other than part of the town's scenery. She appeared in the doorway to the back room, and Jack's breath caught. He'd seen Evelyn Hart before, of course, had probably passed her on the street a dozen times, had maybe even bought supplies from this store while she worked here. But he'd never really looked at her, never noticed the way her dark hair caught hints of auburn in the light, or how her eyes, a clear, startling gray, seemed to see more than most people showed. She was small, barely came up to his shoulder, with a neat figure in a simple calico dress, and an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "Mr. Merritt," she said quietly, and her voice was like water over stones, soft but steady. "Miss Hart." Jack held out his shirt, feeling ridiculous. "Button came off. I heard you do mending." She took the shirt from him, her fingers brushing his for just a second. Her hands were small but looked strong, the hands of someone who worked. "I do," she said. "It'll be ready tomorrow." "Thank you." He should leave now. Should turn around and walk out, leave her in peace until the awful ceremony that would bind them together. But his feet wouldn't move. "Miss Hart, I'm sorry. About all this. About the bet and the wedding, and..." He gestured helplessly. "Everything." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. In the background, her father was making a show of organizing stock, but Jack could feel the man's attention like a physical weight. "Are you sorry you made the bet?" Evelyn asked, her quiet voice somehow cutting through the air like a blade. "Or sorry you lost?" The question stunned him with its directness. Jack opened his mouth, then closed it again, realizing he didn't have a good answer. "Both," he finally admitted. "I'm sorry for both." Something flickered in her gray eyes, not forgiveness exactly, but maybe understanding. Or maybe just acknowledgement that they were both trapped in the same absurd situation. "I'll have your shirt ready tomorrow," she repeated, and it was clearly a dismissal. Jack nodded and left, the bell chiming his exit. He made it 3 steps down the street before he had to stop and lean against a post, his heart still racing for reasons he couldn't quite name. Behind him, inside the store, he didn't hear Samuel Hart move to stand beside his daughter. "You don't have to do this," Samuel said quietly. "Bet or no bet, I won't force you to marry him." Evelyn folded Jack's shirt carefully, her fingers finding the missing button by touch. And what happens to him if I refuse? He'll have to leave town, won't he? Lost honor, lost word. That's his problem. He made his choice. We all make choices, Evelyn said softly. Some of us just have fewer to choose from. She looked up at her father, and her expression held a determination that people who only saw her quietness always missed. I'm 22 years old. How many marriage prospects do you think I have in Coyote Ridge? How many men have come calling? Samuel's silence was answer enough. In a town where women were scarce and valued, Evelyn had somehow remained uncourted. Too quiet, people said. Too odd. Too much inside her own head. At least this way, Evelyn continued, I know what I'm getting. A husband who didn't choose me, but who will be bound to me by honor. That's more than some women get. She paused. And maybe more than he deserves. But life isn't about deserve, is it? She carried the shirt to her mending basket, leaving her father standing alone in the store, wondering when exactly his little girl had become so wise and so resigned all at once. The remaining days before the wedding passed in a blur of preparation that felt more like funeral arrangements. Jack endured fittings at the tailor, where Silas Brown took his measurements with the grim efficiency of a man building a coffin. He signed papers at the minister's house, legal documents that would bind him to a woman he didn't know, creating obligations he'd spent his whole life avoiding. The town buzzed with gossip. In the saloon, at the general store, outside the church, everywhere Jack went, conversation stopped just long enough for him to know he was the subject. Some people looked at him with pity, others with amusement, a few with outright contempt. On the morning of the wedding, Jack stood in his room above the barber shop staring at himself in the small, cracked mirror. The suit Silas had made was simple but well cut, dark gray wool that made Jack look almost respectable. He barely recognized himself. A knock on the door announced Sal Murphy, who'd somehow been drafted as Jack's witness and escort to the church. Time to face the music, Sal said, not unkindly. Church is filling up. Half the territory must have come to watch this spectacle. Jack's stomach churned. That's supposed to make me feel better? Nothing's going to make you feel better, son. You bet your freedom and lost. Now you pay the price. Sal clapped him on the shoulder. But between you and me, I've seen worse matches. At least you're both sober and breathing. That's more than some couples manage. They walked to the church together through streets that seemed accusingly bright. The little white chapel sat at the edge of town, its bell tower reaching toward a mercilessly blue sky. Wagons and horses crowded the area. Sal hadn't been exaggerating about the crowd. Inside, every pew was packed. Jack recognized faces from all over the territory, ranchers who'd lost money to him at cards, store owners he'd charmed and cheated, women who'd watched him swagger through town without ever sparing them more than a wink. They'd all come to see the cocky gambler get his comeuppance. Reverend Brennan waited at the altar, his expression neutral, but his eyes kind. Beside him stood Cyrus Blackwood and the Patterson brothers, the architects of Jack's fate, witnesses to ensure he went through with it. Jack took his place at the altar, his legs feeling distinctly unsteady. The church organ wheezed to life, playing a traditional wedding march that sounded ominous in his ears. The back doors opened. Evelyn Hart appeared in a dress of pale blue calico, not white, because this wasn't that kind of wedding. Her hair was gathered simply at the nape of her neck, and she carried no flowers. Samuel Hart walked beside her, his hand on her elbow, his face a mask of controlled emotion. As they walked down the aisle, Jack watched Evelyn's face. She didn't look scared, didn't look angry. She looked composed in a way that made him feel simultaneously better and worse, like she'd accepted this fate with a grace he couldn't begin to muster. When they reached the altar, Samuel placed his daughter's hand in Jack's. Her fingers were cold and steady. For just a second, their eyes met, and Jack saw something in that gray gaze. Not resentment exactly, but a kind of resigned determination. We're in this now, her eyes seemed to say. Might as well see it through. Reverend Brennan began the ceremony. His voice washed over Jack like water, the familiar words strange and heavy with meaning. Marriage, commitment, till death do us part. Words Jack had never imagined applied to him. Do you, Jack Merritt, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? Jack's throat was desert dry. Every eye in the church pressed on him, waiting, judging. He could still say no, could refuse right here in front of everyone and damn the consequences. But he looked at Evelyn again, at her quiet strength, her dignity in a situation neither of them had chosen, and something inside him, pride or shame or maybe decency, made him say, "I do." The church exhaled collectively. "And do you, Evelyn Hart, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Evelyn said, but her voice was so soft that Reverend Brennan had to ask her to repeat it. The second time was barely louder, but it was clear enough. "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Brennan closed his prayer book with a definitive thump. "You may kiss the bride." Jack hadn't thought about this part, hadn't considered that he'd be expected to kiss this stranger, this woman who was now legally bound to him. He leaned down awkwardly, intending just a brief, chaste brush of lips, a formality to satisfy the crowd. But when his lips touched hers, something unexpected happened. A spark, electric and undeniable, jumped between them. Evelyn's eyes widened in surprise, and Jack pulled back as if burned, his heart suddenly racing for entirely new reasons. The church erupted in applause and catcalls. Someone in the back whistled, but Jack barely heard it. He was staring at his new wife, at the slight flush now coloring her cheeks, wondering if she'd felt it too, or if he was losing his mind on top of everything else. Evelyn's expression gave nothing away. She simply turned and walked back down the aisle, her hand resting lightly on Jack's arm, because tradition demanded it. They emerged into the Arizona sunshine as husband and wife, and Jack felt like he'd just bet everything on a hand he hadn't even looked at yet. The reception, such as it was, took place at the Lucky Dollar Saloon, because where else would Jack Merritt's wedding be celebrated? Tables had been pushed together, and someone had made a half-hearted attempt at decoration with ribbons that looked left over from Christmas 3 years ago. Food appeared, the communal effort of various townswomen who'd taken pity on Evelyn despite the bizarre circumstances. There was roasted meat, beans, cornbread, and a cake that Martha Brennan had apparently bullied someone into baking. It all tasted like sawdust in Jack's mouth. He sat at the head table with Evelyn beside him, acutely aware of every inch of space between them. She ate daintily, responded politely when people congratulated her, and generally acted like this was just another Sunday social rather than the most surreal day of Jack's life. "You're handling this well," he muttered under his breath, not sure if he was complimenting or accusing her. She glanced at him, those gray eyes unreadable. "What choice do I have?" It was a fair question. What choice did either of them have, really? As the afternoon wore on, people began to drift away. Ranch work didn't stop for weddings, even scandalous ones. By late afternoon, only a few stragglers remained, and Jack realized he was going to have to figure out what happened next. He'd never thought about where they'd live, never considered the practical reality of being married. His room above the barbershop was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. As if reading his thoughts, Samuel Hart appeared at their table. He looked older than he had that morning, worn down by the weight of giving away his daughter to a man he neither liked nor trusted. "There's a house," Samuel said without preamble, "on Cottonwood Lane, old Widow Henderson's place. She moved to live with her daughter in Tucson last month. It's small, but it's furnished and the rent's paid through the end of the year." He placed a key on the table between them. "Wedding present. From me." Evelyn looked up at her father, and for the first time all day, her composure cracked just slightly. "Papa." "You'll need a place to start," Samuel interrupted gently. "Might as well be somewhere decent." He looked at Jack, and his eyes were hard. "You take care of her, Merritt, or bet or no bet, honor or no honor, you'll answer to me. Are we clear?" Jack met the older man's gaze and nodded. "We're clear." Samuel left without another word. Evelyn picked up the key, turning it over in her fingers like it might hold answers to questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. "I guess we should go see it," she said quietly. They walked to Cottonwood Lane in silence, their shadows stretching long in the late afternoon sun. The house was indeed small, just 4 rooms with a front porch that sagged slightly on one side. But it was clean, and through the windows Jack could see furniture that looked serviceable if not fancy. Evelyn unlocked the door and stepped inside. Jack followed, feeling like an intruder in what was supposedly now his own home. The front room held a sofa with faded upholstery, a table with two chairs, and a fireplace that probably worked better in theory than practice. Two doors led off from the main room, one to a bedroom, one to a kitchen. One bedroom. They both realized it at the same time. Evelyn went still, staring at the door. Jack felt heat creep up his neck. "I'll take the sofa," he said quickly. "You take the bedroom. We don't have to, this doesn't have to be that kind of marriage. Not until." He was babbling and knew it, but couldn't seem to stop. Evelyn turned to look at him, and something in her expression softened just slightly. "Thank you," she said. Then, "I'll make supper. There should be something in the kitchen." She disappeared through the kitchen door, leaving Jack standing alone in his new home, married to a woman he didn't know, bound by a bet he couldn't take back. He sank onto the sofa, dropped his head into his hands, and wondered how the hell he was supposed to live this life he'd accidentally gambled himself into. In the kitchen, Evelyn stood at the stove, her hands shaking just slightly as she worked. She'd held herself together all day, through the ceremony, through the reception, through her father's heartbreaking attempt at a wedding gift. But now, alone in this strange kitchen, in this strange house with a stranger for a husband, the reality of it all pressed down on her like a physical weight. She was married. To Jack Merritt, the gambler who'd never looked at her twice before a card game forced his hand. This was her life now. This small house on Cottonwood Lane. This man who looked at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. This marriage neither of them wanted. Evelyn Merritt now, she reminded herself, took a deep breath and began preparing supper. If this was her fate, she'd make the best of it. She'd survived worse than an unwanted husband. She was quiet, but she wasn't weak. And maybe, just maybe, Jack Merritt would learn the difference. In the front room, Jack finally looked up. Through the kitchen door, he could see Evelyn moving with efficient grace, her hands steady as she chopped vegetables he didn't even know they had. Competent, capable, completely self-contained, the quietest woman in town. He'd thought that meant weak, meek, easy to ignore. But watching her now, Jack realized he'd been a fool. Evelyn Hart's silence wasn't weakness. It was armor, and he had no idea what lay beneath it. "Supper's ready," she called softly, and Jack stood to join his wife at the table they'd now share for however long this impossible arrangement lasted. Neither of them knew it yet, but that first quiet meal together was the beginning of something neither could have predicted. The bet had changed Jack's life, but the woman he'd married, the quiet, determined, mysterious woman now sitting across from him, would change everything else. The cards had been dealt. The game was just beginning. And this time, winning looked nothing like Jack had imagined. The first night in this house on Cottonwood Lane passed in careful silence. They ate the simple meal Evelyn had prepared. Beans with salt pork, cornbread, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. Jack complimented the food because it seemed like the right thing to do, and Evelyn thanked him with a small nod that gave away nothing of what she might be thinking. After the dishes were washed and put away, she retreated to the bedroom without ceremony, closing the door with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Jack stretched out on the sofa, still wearing his wedding suit, because he hadn't thought to bring any of his belongings from his room above the barbershop. The sofa was too short for his frame, forcing him to bend his legs awkwardly, and a spring poked insistently into his lower back. He stared at the ceiling, watching shadows play across the whitewashed boards as moonlight filtered through the window, and tried to convince himself that this was temporary, that somehow, eventually, things would return to normal. But normal was gone. Normal had died the moment those cards hit the table. Somewhere around midnight, he heard it, a soft sound from the bedroom. Not quite crying, but something close. The sound of someone trying very hard not to cry. Jack's chest tightened with an unfamiliar guilt. This wasn't just happening to him. Evelyn was trapped in this too, maybe even more than he was. At least he'd been stupid enough to make the bet. She'd just been the quietest woman in town, minding her own business, and now she was married to a stranger because 3 ranchers wanted to teach that stranger a lesson. He thought about knocking on the door, about saying something comforting, but what the hell did he know about comfort? So he stayed on the sofa with its vengeful spring and listened to his wife cry herself to sleep, hating himself a little more with each stifled sob. Morning arrived with aggressive cheerfulness, all bright sun and bird song like the universe was mocking them. Jack woke with a crick in his neck and the certainty that every decision he'd made in the past week had been catastrophically wrong. He could hear Evelyn moving in the kitchen, the soft clank of the coffee pot, the crackle of a fire being coaxed to life in the stove. When he finally dragged himself off the sofa, she was already dressed in a simple brown work dress, her hair pinned up practically, no trace of last night's tears on her composed face. She poured him coffee without asking if he wanted any, set it on the table, and returned to the stove where something was sizzling in a pan. "I need to get my things from my room," Jack said, his voice rough with sleep. "Above the barber shop." "All right," Evelyn replied without turning around. "I'll be at the store today. Papa will need help with inventory." It was such a mundane exchange, so aggressively normal, that it felt surreal. They were married, bound together by law and custom, but talking like casual acquaintances discussing the weather. Jack drank his coffee, ate the eggs and toast she set before him, and left the house feeling more lost than he had in years. The walk to the barber shop took him past the Lucky Dollar saloon, and he found his feet slowing as he approached. Through the window, he could see a few early patrons already bellied up to the bar. The sight pulled at something in his chest, the familiar comfort of whiskey and cards, of a life that made sense even if it was going nowhere. He pushed through the doors before he could talk himself out of it. Sal Murphy looked up from wiping down the bar, his expression somewhere between sympathy and disappointment. "Little early to start drinking, even for you." "Just one," Jack said, settling onto a stool. "To steady my nerves." "Your nerves or your conscience?" Sal poured a finger of whiskey anyway, sliding the glass across the polished wood. "How's married life treating you? Been a whole 12 hours. Jack tossed back the whiskey, feeling it burn down his throat. "Like being buried alive, but slower." "That bad, huh?" Sal refilled the glass without being asked. "The girl give you trouble?" "No," Jack admitted, and that was somehow worse. "She's been fine. Quiet. Exactly like everyone said." He stared into his second drink. "She cried last night. Thought I couldn't hear her, but I did." Sal's expression softened. "Well, hell, Jack, her whole life just got turned upside down because you couldn't walk away from a bad bet. Give the girl time to adjust." "Time," Jack repeated bitterly. "We've got nothing but time now. The rest of our lives, trapped in a house on Cottonwood Lane, pretending to be something neither of us signed up for." "Except you did sign up for it," Sal pointed out, his tone gentle but firm. "The moment you said deal, the moment you thought you were too good to lose." He pulled the whiskey bottle away before Jack could reach for a third pour. "Go get your things. Go home to your wife. And maybe try being a decent husband, even if you're a reluctant one. Might surprise yourself." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to demand another drink, wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. Instead, he threw a few coins on the bar and climbed the stairs to his old room. It looked smaller than he remembered. More pathetic. His entire life fit into 2 saddlebags and a trunk. A gambler's wardrobe, a few books, some personal items that didn't amount to much of anything. He packed mechanically, each item a reminder of the rootless existence he'd been leading. When he came back down, Sal was serving another customer, but he caught Jack's eye and nodded. A small gesture of encouragement from a man who'd seen Jack at his worst, and somehow still thought he might be capable of better. The house on Cottonwood Lane was empty when Jack returned. Evelyn had meant what she said about working at her father's store. He unpacked his things in the bedroom. She'd cleared half the dresser and part of the wardrobe for him without being asked, and tried not to feel like an intruder in his own home. The days that followed developed a strange, stilted rhythm. Evelyn rose early, made breakfast, and left for the store. Jack wandered town looking for work, discovering that his reputation as a gambler didn't exactly inspire confidence in potential employers. He helped at the livery stable for a few days, mucked stalls at the Patterson Ranch for a week, did odd jobs wherever someone would have him. The work was honest but sporadic, and it paid poorly. Evenings, they ate supper together in near silence. Evelyn would ask about his day in her quiet voice, and Jack would give brief answers before asking about hers. She'd respond with even briefer summaries, and then they'd finish their meal in the kind of silence that felt less companionable and more like 2 people trapped in the same cell, conserving air. After supper, Jack would flee to the front porch, or more often, back to the Lucky Dollar. He'd nurse 1 or 2 drinks. He'd promised himself he wouldn't become a drunk on top of everything else. and watch other men play cards. His fingers would itch to join in, to feel that familiar thrill of the bet, the turn of the card. But he couldn't. Word had spread about his situation, and no one wanted to gamble with a man who'd lost everything at the tables. It was like he carried bad luck now, and luck was the only currency that mattered in a game. Evelyn never complained about his absences, never asked where he went or when he'd be home. She just maintained the house, cooked the meals, and lived her life in parallel to his, two tracks that never quite converged. 3 weeks into the marriage, Samuel Hart stopped by the house on a Saturday afternoon. Jack was on the porch, trying to fix the sagging boards with limited success and even less expertise. He looked up to see his father-in-law standing at the gate, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Hart," Jack said, straightening up. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his hands blistered from the unfamiliar work. "The porch needs more than hammering," Samuel observed, his tone neutral. "Needs new support beams, whole structures rotted through." "I know," Jack admitted, "just trying to make it last a bit longer." Samuel studied him for a long moment. "You feeding my daughter properly?" "She cooks. I eat what she makes." "That's not what I asked." Jack set down his hammer, meeting the older man's gaze. "I'm doing the best I can with what I've got, which admittedly isn't much, but she's not going hungry, if that's what you're asking." Something in Samuel's expression shifted slightly. Not quite approval, but maybe a grudging acknowledgement that Jack was trying. "She working too much at the store?" "I don't know," Jack said honestly. "She doesn't talk about it much. Doesn't talk about much of anything, actually." "She's always been that way," Samuel said, his voice softening. "Even as a little girl. Her mother used to worry, thought maybe something was wrong with her. But there's nothing wrong with Evelyn. She just keeps things inside." He paused. "You being good to her?" It was the question Jack had been dreading. What did good even mean in this situation? He wasn't cruel, wasn't mean, but he also wasn't there, not really. He was a ghost haunting his own marriage, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. "I'm trying to be fair," Jack said finally. "Trying not to make this worse than it already is." Samuel nodded slowly. "Fair's a start. But marriage needs more than fair, Jack. Needs effort. Needs presence." He turned to leave, then stopped. "She's stronger than she looks, but everyone's got a breaking point. Don't push her to hers just because you're miserable. She didn't ask for this any more than you did." After Samuel left, Jack sat on the broken porch and thought about breaking points. About the sound of Evelyn crying that first night. About the way she moved through the house like a quiet shadow, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, getting exactly that. That evening he came home before dark for the first time in a week. Evelyn looked up in surprise when he walked through the door, a dish towel in her hands, her hair slightly disheveled from the heat of the kitchen. "You're early," she said. "Thought I should be home for supper," Jack replied, "instead of wandering off after." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It'll be ready in 10 minutes. There's water in the basin if you want to wash up." They ate together, and this time Jack made an effort at conversation beyond the perfunctory. He asked about specific customers at the store, about her father's health, about whether she'd heard the news that the Patterson brothers were buying more land. Evelyn answered each question thoughtfully, her voice gaining a bit more strength as the meal progressed. She even offered her own observations, that Mrs. Brennan was ordering an unusual amount of fabric, suggesting the minister's wife was planning something, and that the new school teacher seemed overwhelmed by the prospect of 20 children of varying ages in one room. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd managed before. After supper, instead of fleeing to the saloon, Jack stayed. He sat in the front room while Evelyn mended clothes by lamplight, her needle moving with quick, precise stitches. The silence between them felt different tonight, less oppressive, more like the quiet of two people simply sharing space. "I'm sorry," Jack said suddenly, surprising himself as much as her. Evelyn's hand stilled on the fabric. "For what specifically?" "All of it. The bet, the marriage. For being a lousy husband who can't even fix a porch properly." He laughed without humor. "For ruining your life because I was too arrogant to walk away from a card game." She set down her mending and looked at him directly. In the lamplight, her gray eyes seemed darker, more complex. "You want to know something? I was angry at first. Furious, actually. Spent that whole first night wanting to scream at someone. You, those ranchers, God, anyone who'd listen. She folded her hands in her lap. But then I realized something. My life wasn't exactly full of prospects before this happened. That doesn't make it right. No, she agreed, but it makes it real. And real is something I can work with. She picked up her mending again. I've spent my whole life being the quiet one, the overlooked one. My mother died and I learned to keep house and mind the store and not make waves. Men in this town either don't notice me at all, or they notice and decide I'm too strange, too silent, too much work to bother with. Her needle moved steadily. At least now I have a home of my own. A purpose beyond being Samuel Hart's spinster daughter. Jack felt something crack in his chest. That's a pretty low bar for marriage. Maybe, Evelyn said, but it's the bar we've got. We can spend the rest of our lives resenting each other, or we can make the best of it. Your choice, Jack. It was the most she'd said at once since the wedding, and every word carried weight. Jack realized that while he'd been wallowing in self-pity, Evelyn had been doing what she always did, surviving, adapting, moving forward with quiet determination. I don't know how to be married, he admitted. Don't know how to be anything except a gambler who's not allowed to gamble anymore. Then figure it out, she said simply. Figure out who Jack Merritt is when he's not playing cards, because that's who you're going to have to be now. She went to bed shortly after, leaving Jack alone with his thoughts and the uncomfortable realization that his wife, his quiet, overlooked wife, was braver than he'd ever been. The next morning, Jack woke before dawn with something approaching determination. If he was going to be married, if he was going to be stuck in this life, then he damn well better make something of it. He couldn't be a gambler anymore. Fine. But he could be something else. He just had to figure out what. He started by actually fixing the porch, or trying to. He bought proper lumber with money he'd earned mucking stalls, studied the rotted supports, and began the slow process of replacement. It took him 3 days and resulted in multiple splinters, one smashed thumb, and a great deal of cursing, but eventually the porch stopped sagging quite so dramatically. Evelyn watched his progress from the kitchen window, and on the third evening, she brought him a cup of water and examined his work. It's not perfect, Jack said defensively. No, she agreed. But it's solid. That's better than perfect. He looked at her, trying to read the expression on her face. Was that approval? Pride? He couldn't tell, but it felt like something. He took on more steady work at the livery stable, mucking stalls and tending horses for a man named Dutch Henderson, who didn't particularly care about Jack's past as long as he showed up on time. The work was hard and dirty and paid poorly, but it was regular. It was something. At night, instead of going to the saloon, he came home. Sometimes he'd work on small repairs around the house. Sometimes he'd read one of his few books aloud while Evelyn sewed, and she'd listen without comment, but also without leaving the room, which felt like progress. Sometimes they'd just sit in comfortable silence, the kind that felt less like avoidance and more like peace. 6 weeks into the marriage, Jack came home to find Evelyn in the kitchen garden, a small plot she'd been cultivating behind the house. She was on her knees in the dirt, her dress protected by an old apron, planting something he didn't recognize. "What's that?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Tomatoes," she said without looking up, "and some herbs, basil, thyme, rosemary, things that grow well here if you give them enough water." Jack watched her work, the way her hands moved confidently in the soil, planting and patting and arranging. She looked content in a way he'd never seen before, completely absorbed in the simple act of growing things. "Need any help?" he offered. She glanced up, surprise clear on her face. "You know anything about gardening?" "Not a damn thing," he admitted. "But I can learn." Something shifted in her expression, a small crack in her careful composure. "All right, you can water. The plants need it every evening, especially in this heat. Slowly, so it soaks in rather than running off." He took the watering can she offered and followed her instructions, moving carefully between the small plants she'd arranged in neat rows. It was simple work, almost meditative, and for the first time in weeks, Jack felt like he was actually contributing something to their strange shared life. As the sun set and painted the desert sky in shades of orange and purple, they worked side by side in the small garden. Evelyn showed him how to check the soil for moisture, how to spot the tiny sprouts of new growth, how to pull weeds without disturbing the plants. My mother had a garden, she said quietly, before she died. She used to say that growing things kept her sane in a place where everything else tried to kill you. She sat back on her heels, wiping dirt from her hands. I always thought that was dramatic, but now I think I understand. Jack crouched beside her, studying the small plants that represented hope in a place that often felt hopeless. It's something alive, he said, something that grows instead of just surviving. Yes, Evelyn agreed, and when she looked at him, there was something new in her eyes. Not love. They weren't anywhere near that. But maybe understanding, maybe the beginning of something that could, with time and care, grow into more. That night, for the first time, Evelyn didn't immediately retreat to the bedroom after supper. They sat on the newly repaired porch together, watching the desert night settle in with its particular quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, someone's dog answered. "Tell me something true," Evelyn said suddenly. "Something about you that has nothing to do with cards or gambling or bets." Jack thought for a long moment. It had been so long since he'd defined himself as anything other than a gambler that he had to dig deep to find something else. "I wanted to be a rancher once," he said finally. "When I was young, maybe 14 or 15, my father worked on a big spread in Texas, and I used to watch the owner ride around his land like he was surveying a kingdom. I thought that was the finest thing, to own land, to build something that would last, to leave something behind." He laughed softly. "Then my father died. I went east, learned to play cards, and forgot all about that dream. Seemed easier to live off my wits than to work myself to death for something I'd probably never have." Evelyn absorbed this quietly. "Is that why you made the bet? For the land?" "Partly," Jack admitted. "The Hartley Ranch. 200 acres. It was everything I'd ever wanted, right there for the taking. Just had to win." He shook his head. "Turned out winning was the one thing I couldn't do when it actually mattered." "Maybe you won something different," Evelyn suggested. "Something you didn't know you needed." Jack looked at her, at this quiet woman who was slowly revealing depths he'd never suspected. "Maybe," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it yet. She stood, brushing off her skirt. "I'm going to bed. Don't stay up too late." It was such a wifely thing to say, so domestic and normal that it made Jack smile despite himself. "Yes, ma'am." After she'd gone inside, Jack stayed on the porch, looking out at the dark desert and thinking about ranches and gardens and the strange turns life could take. He'd lost everything at that card table, his freedom, his pride, his carefully constructed life. But sitting here on this porch he'd rebuilt with his own hands, at a house he was slowly learning to call home, married to a woman he was slowly learning to know, Jack wondered if maybe Evelyn was right. Maybe he'd won something after all. He just had to figure out what to do with it. Inside the house, Evelyn stood in the bedroom, her hand on the doorframe, listening to Jack move around on the porch. She could hear the creak of the boards under his weight, the soft sound of him settling into the chair, the quiet that meant he was thinking. She'd meant what she said about her life not having many prospects. But that didn't mean this arrangement didn't hurt, didn't make her feel like a consolation prize in someone else's game. The difference was, she'd learned long ago that feelings were something you carried rather than something you displayed. Her silence had always been armor against a world that didn't particularly care about the inner life of Samuel Hart's strange, quiet daughter. But Jack was trying. She saw it in the repaired porch, in the watered garden, in the way he'd started coming home instead of hiding in saloons. He was clumsy at it, uncertain, clearly had no idea what he was doing. But he was trying, and that was more than she'd expected from a man who'd been forced to marry her. Maybe that was enough to start with. Maybe effort, however imperfect, was the foundation they could build on. She changed into her nightgown and climbed into the bed that still felt too large, despite Jack's belongings now sharing the room. Tomorrow she'd go to the store, tend to customers, help her father with inventory. Jack would work at the livery, come home smelling of horses and hay, probably make some comment about being too tired for conversation. They'd eat supper, maybe work in the garden, sit on the porch for a while. It wasn't romance, it wasn't passion, but it was becoming something, a life, a partnership, a strange sort of companionship between two people who'd been thrown together by chance and were making the best of it. And sometimes, Evelyn thought as she drifted toward sleep. The best of a bad situation was all anyone could ask for. The rest, the connection, the understanding, maybe even affection, that would have to grow slowly, like her tomatoes, nurtured carefully over time. Outside, Jack finally stood and went inside, treading quietly so as not to wake his wife. He settled onto the sofa, which he'd gotten used to despite its vengeful spring, and stared at the ceiling. He'd lost at cards. But maybe, just maybe, he was learning how to win at something more important. He just had to be patient enough to see it through. The desert night settled around the little house on Cottonwood Lane, holding within it two people who were slowly, carefully, learning what it meant to be bound together. Not by love, not yet, but by something equally powerful, the determination to survive, to adapt, and perhaps eventually to thrive. The cards had been dealt. The hand was still being played, and neither Jack nor Evelyn knew yet what the final outcome would be. But they were both still at the table, and that counted for something. Summer deepened into the kind of heat that made the desert shimmer and good sense evaporate. The garden behind the house on Cottonwood Lane somehow survived, producing small green tomatoes that Evelyn checked every morning with something approaching tenderness. Jack watched her with those plants, saw the way she'd touched the leaves gently, testing for moisture and health, and wondered when exactly his wife had stopped being a stranger and started being someone he actually noticed. It happened in small moments, the way she'd leave his coffee on the table exactly how he liked it, strong enough to strip varnish with just a touch of sugar. The way she'd mended his work shirt without being asked, reinforcing the seams that took the most stress. The way she'd sometimes hum while cooking, so softly he almost couldn't hear it, a tune he didn't recognize but that felt like contentment. He tried to reciprocate in his own clumsy way. Started bringing home small things from town, a ribbon he'd seen her admiring in the general store window, a newspaper from Tucson when the stagecoach brought them in, wildflowers he'd spotted on his way back from the livery. She never said much when he presented these offerings, just a quiet thank you, and a small smile that made something warm spread through his chest. 2 months into the marriage, Jack came home to find the house empty. It was late afternoon, and Evelyn should have been back from the store by now. A note on the table in her neat handwriting explained she'd gone to help Martha Brennan with the church social preparations and would be back by supper. Jack found himself at loose ends. The house felt different without her quiet presence, somehow larger and emptier. He wandered through the rooms, noticing things he'd been too self-absorbed to see before. The curtains she'd sewn from flour sacks dyed a soft yellow. The wildflowers he'd brought her last week, arranged in a jar on the kitchen windowsill. The way she'd organized his few books on a shelf she'd somehow procured, arranged by height rather than any system that made sense to him, but arranged with care nonetheless. In the bedroom, he noticed she'd been reading one of his books, a collection of poetry he'd won in a card game years ago and never opened. It sat on her side of the bed with a ribbon marking her place. Jack picked it up carefully, opened to the marked page, and read the poem she'd stopped at. It was about loneliness and longing, about two people passing like ships in the night, never quite connecting despite their proximity. Something twisted in his gut. Was that how she saw them? Two people occupying the same space but never truly together? He was still holding the book when the front door burst open with a violence that sent his heart into his throat. Evelyn stumbled inside, her face flushed, breathing hard like she'd been running. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, and there was dirt smudged across her cheek. "What happened?" Jack demanded, dropping the book and crossing to her in 3 strides. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, but her voice shook slightly. "There was trouble at the church. 5 men, strangers, riding through. They tried to take Mrs. Brennan's jewelry box from the rectory. I was there, and I—" She stopped, took a breath. "I told them to leave." Jack stared at her. "You told them to leave? 5 armed men, and you— Jesus, Evelyn, you could have been killed." "They weren't armed," she corrected, some of her composure returning. "At least not that I saw. They were just opportunistic thieves. Figured the church would be easy pickings with most of the men out working." She straightened her torn dress absently. "I grabbed the rifle from behind the door. Reverend Brennan keeps it there for rattlesnakes, and told them if they didn't leave, I'd shoot." "And they just left?" Jack asked, still trying to process the image of his quiet wife facing down 5 thieves. Not exactly. She walked to the kitchen basin and began washing the dirt from her face. One of them laughed, said, "I didn't look like I knew which end of a rifle to hold, so I shot his hat off." Jack's mouth fell open. "You what?" "Shot his hat off," Evelyn repeated calmly, drying her face on a towel. "It was on his head at the time, so it was quite a good shot, actually. The bullet went clean through the crown. He stopped laughing after that." She set down the towel. Mrs. Brennan started screaming, which brought some of the other women, and the men decided they'd had enough and rode off. Sheriff Morrison is organizing a posse to track them, but I doubt they'll come back to Coyote Ridge after this. Jack found himself sitting down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, his legs suddenly unreliable. His wife, his quiet, unassuming wife, had faced down 5 thieves with a rifle and shot the hat off one of their heads like it was nothing. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked when he could find his voice. Evelyn started preparing supper like this was any other evening, like she hadn't just revealed herself to be some kind of sharpshooter. "My father taught me. After my mother died, he said I needed to know how to protect myself. We'd practice out behind the store on Sundays, shooting at cans and targets." She glanced at him. "I'm quite good, actually. Better than most of the men in town, though they don't know it because I've never had reason to demonstrate." "Until today," Jack said faintly. "Until today," she agreed. She pulled out vegetables for stew, her movements efficient and unhurried. "Are you angry?" "Angry?" Jack ran his hands through his hair. "Evelyn, I'm terrified. You could have been hurt, killed. Those men could have—" He couldn't even finish the thought. "And I'm also impressed, amazed. I don't even know what I am." She stopped chopping and looked at him, really looked at him, and something passed between them that felt significant. "I'm not helpless, Jack. I never have been. Just because I'm quiet doesn't mean I can't take care of myself." "I'm starting to realize that," he said, then surprising himself. "I'm glad you're safe. When I saw you come in looking like that, I thought—" He stopped, uncertain how to articulate the fear that had gripped him. "I was worried." Pink colored her cheeks. "I'm fine. Just a torn dress and some bruised pride for those thieves." She returned to her chopping, though I imagine the whole town will be talking about this by morning. She was right. By the next day, the story had spread through Coyote Ridge like wildfire, growing more elaborate with each telling. By the time Jack arrived at the livery stable for work, Dutch Henderson was grinning at him like Christmas had come early. "Your wife shot a man's hat clean off his head," Dutch announced to the stable in general. "Clean off, while it was still on him. 5 outlaws, and she sent them running like scared rabbits." "They weren't outlaws," Jack corrected, though he knew it was futile. "Just opportunistic thieves." "Same difference," Dutch said cheerfully. "Point is, your quiet little wife is the talk of the territory. The boys at the saloon last night couldn't stop jawing about it. Some of them are saying she's got the steadiest aim in Arizona." Jack spent the day fielding similar comments. By afternoon, he'd given up trying to downplay the story and just accepted the congratulations and ribbing with as much grace as he could muster. When he finally headed home, he found Evelyn in the garden, tending to her plants like nothing extraordinary had happened. "You're famous," he announced, leaning against the doorframe. She didn't look up from the tomato plant she was examining. "I'm notorious. There's a difference." "The whole town's impressed." "The whole town thinks I'm strange," she corrected. "Now they just think I'm strange and dangerous, which I suppose is an improvement." She moved to the next plant. "Mrs. Henderson asked me to teach her daughter to shoot. 3 other women made similar requests. I think they're starting to realize that being quiet doesn't mean being defenseless." Jack watched her work, this woman he'd married without knowing, without choosing, who kept revealing new layers like a mystery he was only beginning to understand. "Will you? Teach them, I mean." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "If they're serious about learning." She straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "My father always said the best way to survive in this territory was to be underestimated. Let people think you're soft, then surprise them when it matters." She met his eyes. "I've been surprising people my whole life, Jack. Today was just more public than usual." That night, something shifted between them. Jack found himself watching Evelyn with new eyes, seeing past the quiet exterior to the steel beneath. She wasn't fragile, wasn't weak. She was a woman who'd learned to survive in a hard place, who'd built armor out of silence and strength out of necessity. Over supper, he asked questions he should have asked weeks ago. About her mother, about growing up in Coyote Ridge, about what she'd wanted before a card game had tangled their lives together. "I wanted to see the ocean," she said, and there was something wistful in her voice. "Read about it in books, but never imagined I'd actually go. Women like me don't leave places like this." She sipped her coffee. "I wanted a garden bigger than a patch of dirt behind a house. Wanted to grow things that mattered, that fed people, that made something beautiful in an ugly place." She paused. "I wanted to matter to someone, not as a housekeeper or a store clerk, but as myself." "You matter," Jack said, and meant it more than he'd expected to. She smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "To my father, maybe. To you, well, you're stuck with me, so I suppose I matter by default." "That's not true," Jack protested, but Evelyn held up a hand. "It's fine, Jack. I understand what this is. We're making the best of a bad situation, and that's more than many couples have. We're civil to each other. We're building something like friendship. That's enough." But it didn't feel like enough anymore, and Jack went to bed on the sofa that night wondering when exactly enough had stopped being satisfactory. The incident at the church had another effect Jack hadn't anticipated. Men started treating him differently, with a new kind of respect that had nothing to do with his gambling skills and everything to do with the woman he'd married. At the saloon, at the livery, in the street, men would clap him on the shoulder and make comments about being lucky in more ways than one. "Never knew Evelyn Hart had that kind of fire in her," Cyrus Blackwood said one afternoon when Jack ran into him at the general store. The old rancher's expression was approving. "Seems like maybe that bet turned out better than you thought." Jack wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his bitter narrative about being trapped and forced, but standing there in Samuel Hart's store, watching Evelyn help a customer with patient kindness, he couldn't quite summon the resentment anymore. "Maybe," he admitted. Samuel appeared from the back room, his arms full of inventory. He saw Jack and Evelyn together, and something flickered across his face, not quite approval, but perhaps the beginning of acceptance. "Jack," Samuel said, nodding, "you sticking around for supper? Evelyn usually helps me close up on Thursdays." It was the first time Samuel had addressed him by his first name rather than just Merritt, and Jack recognized it for what it was, an olive branch, tentative and uncertain. "I can help," Jack offered, "if you need it." The three of them worked together, organizing stock and sweeping floors and preparing the store for the next day. Samuel talked about his plans to expand the inventory, maybe order some new fabrics and tools that had been requested. Evelyn added her own observations about what sold well and what sat on shelves gathering dust. Jack mostly listened, but he carried heavy crates and reached high shelves, making himself useful in small ways. When they finally closed up and walked home together, Samuel stopped at the gate of the house on Cottonwood Lane. He looked at the repaired porch, at the garden visible around the side, at the general air of a place being cared for. "You're doing all right," he said, and Jack understood he was talking about more than just home repairs. "Better than I expected, honestly." After Samuel left, Evelyn and Jack stood in the gathering twilight, the air cooling finally after another scorching day. "He's trying to forgive you," Evelyn said quietly, "for being forced on me, for taking his daughter because of a stupid bet." "Is he succeeding?" Jack asked. "I think so, slowly." She started toward the house, then paused. "Are you trying to forgive yourself?" When Dutch came running in, his face pale despite the heat. "There's a problem," Dutch said, breathing hard. "Your place. Someone saw smoke." Jack's blood turned to ice. He dropped the shovel he'd been holding and ran, his boots pounding the dirt street, his heart hammering against his ribs. Smoke. Fire. Evelyn was home alone, had been since she'd left the store 2 hours ago. He rounded the corner onto Cottonwood Lane and saw it. Not the house, thank God, but something. Smoke rising from behind the building, thick and dark. He burst through the front door shouting Evelyn's name, terror making his voice crack. She appeared from the back, soot-smudged and wild-eyed, carrying a bucket of water. "The garden shed," she gasped. "Lightning strike, I think, or someone's careless cigarette. It caught fast. Jack ran to the back and saw the small shed they used for tools fully engulfed in flames. The fire was spreading toward the house, toward the garden, licking hungrily at the dry wood and desert vegetation. "Get more water," he shouted, already grabbing another bucket. "As much as you can carry." They worked together in desperate synchronization, hauling water from the pump, throwing it on the spreading flames, stomping out embers that landed on the roof. Other neighbors arrived. Dutch, the Patterson brothers, Sal Murphy, even Cyrus Blackwood, all grabbing buckets and joining the fight. For hours they battled the fire, until Jack's arms screamed with exhaustion and his lungs burned from smoke. Evelyn worked beside him the entire time, never stopping, never complaining, her dress soaked with water and sweat, her hair wild around her face. Finally, as the moon rose high and silver, the last of the flames sputtered out. The shed was a total loss, just charred wood and ash. Part of the garden had been scorched, but the house stood intact, saved by the frantic efforts of Jack and Evelyn and half the town. The neighbors gradually dispersed, offering words of relief and support. The Patterson brothers promised to help rebuild the shed. Cyrus mentioned he had some spare tools Jack could borrow. Dutch just clapped him on the shoulder, too tired for words. When everyone had gone, Jack and Evelyn stood in the ruined backyard, surveying the damage. The smell of smoke hung heavy in the air, and both of them were covered in soot and grime. "We saved it," Evelyn said, her voice hoarse. "We saved the house." "You saved it," Jack corrected. "If you hadn't seen the fire when you did, hadn't started fighting it immediately, the whole place would have gone up." He looked at her, at this woman who kept surprising him. "You didn't panic, didn't freeze. You just fought." She met his eyes, and in the moonlight, covered in soot, exhausted beyond measure, she looked somehow more beautiful than he'd ever seen her. "Of course I fought," she said simply. "It's our home." Our home. Not the house, or this place, but our home. Something Jack hadn't quite allowed himself to think yet, but hearing it from her lips made it real. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt inadequate for what he was feeling. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Admiration, respect, the beginning of something he wasn't quite ready to name. "You came back," she said, echoing words he'd spoken to her weeks ago. "When Dutch told you there was trouble, you came back." "Of course I did," Jack replied, realizing the truth of it. This wasn't just a house anymore. Wasn't just an obligation. This was home, and Evelyn was... He didn't let himself finish that thought. They went inside, both too exhausted to do much more than wash the worst of the soot away, and collapse. Jack headed for the sofa as usual, but Evelyn stopped him with a hand on his arm. "The sofa's too small," she said quietly. "You've been sleeping on it for 2 months, and you wake up stiff every morning. I've seen you trying to work out the kinks in your back." She swallowed, her courage clearly wavering but holding. "The bed is big enough for 2. We're adults. We can share it without anything improper." Jack's heart kicked against his ribs. "Evelyn, I'm not suggesting..." Her face flushed. "I just mean we're married. We share a home. We just fought a fire together. Sharing a bed isn't scandalous, it's practical." She straightened her shoulders. "Unless you're uncomfortable with the idea." He was uncomfortable, but not in the way she probably thought. He was uncomfortable because sharing that bed with her, even platonically, felt like crossing a threshold he'd been carefully avoiding. Felt like admitting this marriage was real in ways he'd been denying. But she was right. The sofa was torture, and they'd both nearly died tonight saving their home. Life was too short and too uncertain to sleep on a vengeful spring out of stubborn pride. "All right," he said. "Thank you." That night, they lay in the same bed for the first time, a careful space between them, both acutely aware of the other's presence. Jack could hear Evelyn's breathing gradually slow as exhaustion pulled her under. He stayed awake longer, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what was happening to him. He'd married Evelyn Hart because he'd lost a bet, had resented her for existing, for being the price of his arrogance. But somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being a burden and started being something else. Someone he looked forward to seeing at the end of the day. Someone whose quiet strength made him want to be stronger himself. Someone who, when she shot a man's hat off his head, or fought a fire with desperate determination, or offered to share her bed out of simple kindness, made his heart do complicated things he didn't have words for. Beside him, Evelyn murmured something in her sleep and shifted slightly closer, not touching him, but near enough that he could feel her warmth. Jack closed his eyes and let himself have this moment of honesty. He was falling for his wife, and he had no idea what to do about it. The next morning, they woke to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of smoke still lingering in the air. For a moment, neither moved, caught in the strange intimacy of waking in the same bed. Then Evelyn stirred, and the spell broke. "I'll make coffee," she said, already rising. Jack watched her go, memorizing the way her hair caught the morning light, the way she moved with quiet grace even when exhausted. He was in trouble, he realized. Deep, complicated, terrifying trouble. Because somewhere between the forced wedding and the shared suppers and the garden they tended together, he'd stopped resenting this marriage and started wanting it to be real. The question was whether Evelyn felt anything close to the same, or whether she was just being practical about a situation neither of them had chosen. And Jack, who'd made his living reading people at card tables, found he couldn't read his own wife at all. The days after the fire settled into a new rhythm, one that felt simultaneously familiar and utterly foreign. They still shared the bed, though both of them clung to their respective edges like the space between them was a chasm neither dared to cross. Jack would wake in the early morning darkness, hyper-aware of Evelyn's presence just inches away, and lie there listening to her breathe until guilt or restlessness drove him from the bed. The Patterson brothers made good on their promise, showing up one Saturday with lumber and tools to rebuild the shed. Jack worked alongside them, grateful for the distraction and the physical labor that kept his mind from circling endlessly around the problem of his wife. Thomas Patterson, ever the more talkative of the twins, made conversation while they hammered and sawed. "You two seem to be settling in all right," Thomas observed, driving a nail with practiced efficiency. "Better than most folks expected, truth be told." But Jack concentrated on holding a board steady. "What did people expect?" "Disaster, mostly," Thomas said cheerfully. "You being forced into marriage, her being stuck with a gambler who'd rather be anywhere else. Town had bets going on how long before one of you ran off or killed the other." He grinned. "I lost $20 thinking you'd be gone by the end of the first month." "Glad I could cost you money," Jack said dryly, though the words stung more than they should have. He'd been so wrapped up in his own misery those first weeks that he hadn't considered how it looked from the outside. Hadn't thought about Evelyn enduring the town's speculation and pity while he'd been drowning his sorrows at the lucky dollar. From the house, they could hear Evelyn's voice as she served lemonade to the other men taking a break. Her laughter drifted out, soft but genuine, at something Cyrus Blackwood had said. Jack found himself turning toward the sound without thinking, drawn to it in a way that would have terrified him a month ago. "She's good for you," Thomas said, following Jack's gaze. "Don't know if you see it yet, but you're different, more settled, less like a tumbleweed about to blow away at the first strong wind." Jack wanted to argue, to maintain that he was exactly the same person he'd always been. But he couldn't because it wasn't true. The man who'd sat down at that card table 3 months ago had been arrogant, rootless, living only for the next game and the next win. That man wouldn't have rebuilt a porch or tended a garden or fought a fire to save a home. That man wouldn't have cared enough to try. By the time they finished the shed, sturdier than the original, Thomas pronounced proudly, the sun was setting and Evelyn had prepared supper for everyone who'd helped. They ate in the front yard, sitting on the porch and on the grass, plates balanced on knees, and for a little while it felt like community, like belonging to something larger than just himself. After everyone had gone home and the dishes were washed, Jack found Evelyn standing in the garden, looking at the scorched section where fire had claimed some of her plants. The tomatoes had survived, though one side was badly burned. She touched the damaged leaves gently, her expression unreadable in the twilight. "I can replant," she said when she noticed him standing there. "It's late in the season, but some things will still grow." "I'll help," Jack offered. "Tomorrow's Sunday. We could work on it together." She glanced at him, something flickering in her gray eyes. "You don't have to, Jack. I know this isn't how you wanted to spend your life, playing house with a wife you never chose." The words hit harder than she probably intended. Jack stepped closer, needing her to understand something he was only now beginning to understand himself. Maybe not at first, he admitted. But things change. People change. I've been changing, Evelyn, and I think it's because of you. Because of me? She sounded genuinely surprised. I haven't done anything except exist in the same house as you. You've done more than that, Jack said, frustration creeping into his voice. You faced down thieves with a rifle. You fought a fire to save our home. You've been patient with me when I deserved nothing but contempt. You've made this house feel like something worth coming back to. He ran his hand through his hair, searching for the right words. I know I've been a lousy husband. I know this isn't what either of us wanted, but I'm trying to be better, and I need you to know that. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said quietly, I know you're trying, Jack. I see it. She paused. But trying doesn't mean you're happy, and I won't settle for being someone's obligation, no matter how well-intentioned. Before he could respond, she'd turned and walked back to the house, leaving him standing alone in the damaged garden with a chest full of words he didn't know how to say. That night, the space between them in the bed felt wider than ever, though neither had moved to their previous positions on the edges. Jack lay awake, replaying the conversation, wishing he'd found better words or different ones, or any that would have made her understand what he was feeling. But emotions had never been his strong suit. Cards, he could read. People's tells at a poker table, he understood. But the quiet complexities of his wife's heart remained a mystery he couldn't solve. The next morning, they worked in the garden as promised, clearing away the burned plants and preparing the soil for new ones. They moved around each other with careful choreography, passing tools, working in tandem, speaking only when necessary. It should have felt comfortable, companionable even. Instead, it felt like they were both holding their breath, waiting for something neither could name. By Monday, Coyote Ridge had new gossip to chew on that momentarily distracted from the ongoing saga of Jack and Evelyn Merritt. A group of men had been spotted camping at the old Hartley Ranch, the same land that had been the prize in Jack's fateful card game. They weren't doing any harm, just passing through supposedly, but something about them made people nervous. Jack heard about it from Dutch at the livery. Sheriff Morrison went out to talk to them, Dutch said, his voice low. Said they were polite enough, claimed to be prospectors heading west. But they've been there 3 days now, and they don't seem to be moving on. Maybe they're just resting, Jack suggested, though something in his gut twisted uncomfortably. Maybe, Dutch agreed, but his expression said he didn't believe it. That evening, Jack mentioned it to Evelyn over supper. She paused with her fork halfway to her mouth, her brow furrowing slightly. The Hartley Ranch is only about 5 miles from here, she said. If they're trouble. They're probably not, Jack said quickly, though he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Just travelers passing through. But 2 days later, trouble proved him wrong. Jack was at the livery when Sarah Patterson came racing into town on horseback, her face flushed with exertion and fear. She pulled up hard enough that her horse nearly sat back on its haunches, and before she'd even dismounted properly, she was shouting for the sheriff. They took our cattle, she gasped when Sheriff Morrison came running. Those men from the Hartley place. They came onto our land with guns and took a dozen head, drove them off toward the hills. My father and brother went after them, but they're outnumbered. The town mobilized with the speed of long practice. Men grabbed rifles, saddled horses, formed into a posse before Jack had fully processed what was happening. He found himself swept up in it, handed a rifle by Dutch, pushed toward a horse he barely knew how to ride. Can you shoot? Morrison asked him directly. Well enough, Jack lied, thinking of Evelyn's steady aim and wishing desperately that he had even a fraction of her skill. Then you're coming. Every gun counts. They rode hard toward the Hartley Ranch, 15 men on horseback kicking up dust that hung golden in the late afternoon sun. Jack's thighs screamed with unaccustomed effort. His hands ached from gripping the reins, but he kept pace. Somewhere in his mind, a voice kept saying that this was insane, that he was a gambler, not a fighter, that he'd never signed up for range wars and cattle rustling. But then he thought of Evelyn, alone at home, and the men who'd stolen from the Pattersons were only 5 miles from Cottonwood Lane, 5 miles from his wife. They found the rustlers trying to move the stolen cattle through a narrow canyon, exactly where Sheriff Morrison had predicted they'd go. Cyrus Patterson and his son Jacob were pinned down behind some rocks, trading sporadic gunfire with 5 men who had superior position and were using the cattle as shields. "Spread out," Morrison ordered. "Half of you circle around to the north ridge. We'll flush them toward the open ground where they can't hide behind the herd." Jack ended up in the group circling north, climbing through scrub brush and loose rocks, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. He'd been in bar fights before, had taken a punch or two, but this was different. This was guns and intent to kill, and he was woefully unprepared. They reached the ridge and began firing, not to hit necessarily, but to drive the rustlers out of their defensible position. Below, Morrison's group pressed from the other side. The cattle, spooked by the gunfire, began to stampede, and the rustlers had to choose between maintaining their position and being trampled. They chose to run. What followed was chaos, men shouting, cattle bellowing, gunfire echoing off the canyon walls. Jack fired his rifle without really aiming, just pointing in the general direction of the fleeing rustlers, hoping to God he didn't hit anyone by accident. The noise was deafening, the dust blinding, everything moving too fast to think, only react. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it was over. The rustlers scattered, abandoning the cattle and riding hard for the territorial border. Morrison let them go. Pursuing across the border would mean paperwork and complications and possibly starting something bigger than a small-town sheriff wanted to handle. They recovered the Patterson cattle, got Cyrus and Jacob out from behind their rocks unharmed, if shaken, and began the long ride back to town. Jack's hands trembled as he rode, adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow and exhausted. He'd done nothing particularly brave or heroic, had barely fired his gun, but he felt like he'd lived an entire lifetime in the space of an hour. It was full dark by the time they reached Coyote Ridge. The town had stayed awake waiting for news, lamps burning in windows. People gathered in small clusters on the street. Jack barely registered any of it. He just handed his horse to Dutch, mumbled something about needing to get home, and started walking toward Cottonwood Lane on legs that felt like water. The house was blazing with light when he arrived. Every lamp must have been lit. Jack pushed through the door and found Evelyn pacing the front room, her face pale, her hands twisted together. She looked up at his entrance, and something broke in her expression. "You're back," she breathed, and then she was crossing the room in 3 quick steps and throwing her arms around him. Jack stood frozen for a moment, shocked by the sudden contact, by the feel of her body pressed against his, trembling slightly. Then instinct took over and his arms came up around her, holding her close, feeling her heart race against his chest. "I'm back," he confirmed, his voice muffled in her hair. "I'm all right." "Sarah Patterson came by," Evelyn said, her words coming fast and uneven. "She told me what happened, about the rustlers and the gunfight, and—" She pulled back just enough to look at him, her hands gripping his arms. "You could have been killed, Jack. You could have died, and the last thing I said to you was that you were just an obligation." "You didn't say that," Jack protested, but she shook her head fiercely. "I implied it. I've been so determined not to feel anything, not to let this marriage become real, that I've been cruel without meaning to be." Her gray eyes were bright with unshed tears. "But when Sarah said there'd been shooting, when I thought you might not come home, I realized—" She stopped, seeming to gather courage. "I realized I would miss you, Jack. Not just the help around the house, or the company at supper. You. The man you're becoming. The man who rebuilds porches and waters gardens and rides into danger even though he's terrified because it's the right thing to do." Jack's heart felt too large for his chest. "Evelyn, I've been falling in love with you," she said in a rush, like the words had been dammed up too long. "Slowly, in small moments, without meaning to, and I've been fighting it because I was afraid you'd never feel the same, that I'd always just be the woman you lost a bet over." She took a shaking breath. "But life's too short and too uncertain to keep pretending I don't care." For a long moment, Jack just stared at her, trying to process words he desperately wanted to hear, but never expected to. Then, because words had always failed him at crucial moments, he did the only thing that made sense. He kissed her. Not the chaste, awkward brush of lips from their wedding. This was real, desperate, 3 months of suppressed longing and denied attraction pouring out in a single moment. Her lips were soft and yielded under his, and when she gasped in surprise, he took advantage, deepening the kiss, pulling her closer until there was no space left between them. Evelyn responded with an intensity that shocked them both. Her hands fisted in his shirt, pulling him down to her, kissing him back with a hunger that matched his own. This wasn't the quiet, reserved woman who spoke in whispers and avoided attention. This was fire and passion barely contained, a wildness she'd kept hidden beneath layers of propriety and self-protection. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers and tried to find words adequate to the moment. "I love you," he said, because sometimes simple was best. "I've been falling for you too, probably since you shot that man's hat off, maybe even before. You terrify me and amaze me and make me want to be better than I've ever been." He cupped her face in his hands, needing her to see the truth in his eyes. "You're not an obligation, Evelyn. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, even if it took a card game to make me see it." She laughed, and it came out half-sob. "That's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me." "Then I need to work on my romantic speeches," Jack said, smiling despite the exhaustion weighing on him. "Because you deserve poetry and declarations and all the things I don't know how to give you." "I don't need poetry," Evelyn said softly. "I just need you. Here, present, not running away to saloons or pretending this isn't real." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes," Jack said without hesitation. "I can do that. I want to do that." They kissed again, slower this time, thorough and promising. When they finally made it to the bedroom, they didn't cling to opposite edges. They met in the middle, wrapped in each other's arms, and for the first time since their forced wedding, it felt like they were truly married. Not because a bet had bound them, but because they'd chosen each other, slowly and painfully and finally. But if Jack thought his troubles were over, he was mistaken. Peace in Coyote Ridge never lasted long, and his particular demons had one more test to throw at him. It happened 2 weeks later, on a Saturday night. Jack had stayed late at the livery helping Dutch with a difficult horse, and by the time he finished, darkness had fallen. He started walking home, tired but content, thinking about Evelyn and supper and the life they were building together. He passed the Lucky Dollar Saloon without intending to stop. But through the window he saw them, the men he used to play cards with, sitting at his old table, laughing over a hand. The familiar sound of chips clicking, cards shuffling, money changing hands pulled at something deep in his chest. The old hunger, dormant for months, suddenly roared to life. Just one game, his mind whispered. Just to prove he could still play, still win. Just to feel that old thrill again. His feet carried him through the doors before he'd consciously decided to enter. The saloon fell briefly quiet when he walked in, then resumed its noise as men went back to their conversations and drinks. Jack approached the card table slowly, watching the game in progress. "Well, well," Sal Murphy said from behind the bar. "Look who's back. Haven't seen you at a table in months, Jack." "Just watching," Jack said, but his voice lacked conviction. One of the players, a rancher named McAllister, looked up and grinned. "Hell, don't just watch. Pull up a chair. We could use fresh blood in this game." Jack knew he should refuse, knew he should turn around and walk home to his wife, to the life that was finally starting to work. But his hands itched for cards, his mind already calculating odds and probabilities, falling back into familiar patterns. "One hand," he heard himself say. "Just one." He sat down, and it felt like coming home in all the wrong ways. The cards felt right in his hands, the weight of chips familiar and comforting. The first hand he folded early, just getting a feel for the players. The second hand he won with a modest pair. Nothing spectacular, but enough to make his pulse quicken with remembered pleasure. The third hand, he went all in on a flush and won big. The old Jack Merritt would have quit there, walked away with his winnings and his pride intact. But something in Jack had broken open when those cards hit his hands, some door he'd worked so hard to close. He kept playing, kept winning, kept chasing that feeling of control and certainty that life had stripped from him. He didn't notice the hours passing, didn't notice Sal Murphy's increasingly concerned looks, didn't notice when midnight came and went, when the saloon started to empty, when he should have been home with Evelyn hours ago. He finally noticed when he looked up from a winning hand and saw her standing in the doorway. The disappointment on Evelyn's face hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't angry, wasn't shouting or causing a scene. She just looked at him with those gray eyes full of hurt and understanding and resignation, and Jack felt his heart crack in his chest. "Evelyn," he started, half rising from his chair, but she held up a hand. "No," she said quietly, but her voice carried in the now silent saloon. "Don't. Don't apologize or make excuses or promise it won't happen again." She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I came because I was worried, because you didn't come home, and after what happened with the rustlers, I thought maybe something had happened to you. But you're fine, you're just—" She gestured at the table, at the cards and chips and the life he'd promised to leave behind. "You're just being who you've always been." "That's not fair," Jack protested, but even as he said it, he knew she was right. The moment he'd sat down at this table, he'd become the old Jack Merritt, the gambler who cared more about the game than about anything or anyone else. "Fair?" Evelyn's voice broke slightly. "You want to talk about fair? You told me you loved me, Jack. You promised you were choosing me, choosing us. But the first time you walk past this place, the first time cards call to you, you forget all of that." She blinked rapidly, fighting tears. "I can't compete with this. I won't compete with this. Either you want the life we're building, or you want this table. But you can't have both." She turned and walked out, and Jack sat frozen, the winning hand still clutched in his fingers, suddenly worth nothing at all. "You better go after her," Sal said quietly from the bar. "Before you lose something you can't win back." Jack looked down at his cards, at his winnings, at the game that had defined him for so long. Then he looked at the door where Evelyn had disappeared, and the choice suddenly became crystal clear. He stood, swept his winnings toward McAllister. "Take it. All of it." "What? Jack, you won fair and square?" "I don't care," Jack interrupted. "I don't want it. I don't want any of this." He looked around the saloon, at the life he was leaving behind. "I'm done. For real this time. No more cards, no more gambling. I'm done." He ran out into the night, searching for Evelyn, his heart pounding with fear that he'd already lost her. He found her halfway down Main Street, walking fast, her shoulders shaking with suppressed sobs. "Evelyn, wait!" he called, running to catch up. "Please, wait!" She stopped but didn't turn around. "Why should I?" "Because I'm an idiot," Jack said, circling to face her. "Because I'm a fool who almost threw away the best thing in his life for a card game. Because I need you to give me one more chance to prove I can be the man you deserve." "You've already had your chances," Evelyn said, but her voice wavered. "How many more am I supposed to give you?" "As many as it takes," Jack said desperately. "I know I messed up. I know I broke my promise. But that wasn't me in there. Or it was the old me, the one I'm trying to leave behind. And I will leave him behind, Evelyn. I swear it. Because cards don't warm my bed at night. Cards don't make me laugh or challenge me to be better or kiss me like I'm the only thing that matters in the world." Evelyn finally looked at him, tears tracking down her cheeks. "How do I know you mean it this time? How do I know you won't walk past that saloon tomorrow and do the same thing?" "You don't," Jack admitted. "I can't promise I won't be tempted, but I can promise I'll fight it. I can promise you matter more than any game, any bet, any win." He took her hands, holding them tightly. "That kiss you gave me earlier, that wild, passionate, incredible kiss that set my soul on fire, Evelyn, made me feel more alive than any card game ever did. And if I have to choose between that feeling and gambling, I choose you. Every single time, I choose you." For a long moment, she just looked at him, searching his face for truth. Then she said softly, "That's what you're throwing away when you sit at that table, Jack. You're throwing away us, our life, our future, everything we could be together." Her hands tightened on his. "I love you. I love you so much it terrifies me. But I won't watch you destroy yourself with cards and whiskey. I won't be the woman waiting at home while you chase ghosts at the gambling table." "You won't have to be," Jack promised. "I left my winnings on the table, walked away from the game, and I'm not going back." He pulled her close, needing her to feel his certainty. "I'm your fool if you'll have me, Evelyn. Just your fool. No one else's." She looked up at him, and something in her expression shifted. Not forgiveness exactly, but maybe the willingness to try. "Then start acting like it," she said. He kissed her there on Main Street, not caring who saw or what anyone thought. Kissed her like she was air and he was drowning, like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. And when she kissed him back, wild and fierce and claiming, Jack knew he'd finally made the right choice. They walked home together, hands clasped tightly, neither speaking but both understanding that something had shifted again. They'd made promises to each other, broken them, made them again. But this time felt different. This time, Jack had chosen her over the thing that had defined him for so long, and that choice meant everything. That night, there was no careful space between them in the bed. They came together with desperate intensity, 3 months of denied passion finally given freedom. Evelyn's wildness matched his own, both of them letting down walls and shedding armor, finding in each other something raw and real and utterly right. Afterwards, lying tangled together in the darkness, Jack held his wife close and made a silent vow. He'd been a gambler, a drunk, a fool. But from now on, he'd be Evelyn's husband, worthy of her love, equal to her strength, present in every moment they built together. The cards had dealt him this hand, but he'd played it himself. And somehow, impossibly, he'd won the greatest prize of all. Morning came too early, sunlight spilling through the window like an accusation. Jack woke with Evelyn curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, one hand splayed over his heart as if claiming it. He lay still, afraid to move and break the spell, afraid this was just another dream that would evaporate with full consciousness. But she was real and warm and his, and the memories of last night flooded back with stunning clarity. Not just the passion, though that had been revelation enough, but everything that came before. His weakness at the card table, her ultimatum on the street, his choice to walk away from the gambling life forever. The weight of that choice settled on him now, heavy but not unwelcome. Like putting down a burden he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Evelyn stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looked confused, as if she too needed to remember where she was and why. Then her gaze focused on him, and pink colored her cheeks. "Good morning," she said softly, suddenly shy in a way she hadn't been in the darkness. "Good morning," Jack replied, his voice rough with sleep and emotion. "You're beautiful." She ducked her head, hiding her face against his shoulder. "You don't have to say things like that." "I'm not saying it because I have to," Jack said, tilting her chin up so she'd look at him. "I'm saying it because it's true. Because I spent 3 months married to you without really seeing you, and now that I'm looking, I can't believe what a blind fool I've been." Evelyn searched his face, and whatever she found there made her smile. Not the small, polite smile she usually offered, but something genuine and unguarded. "We should get up," she said, though neither of them moved. "It's Sunday. People will be heading to church soon." "Let them," Jack said, pulling her closer. "I'm right where I need to be." But eventually, practicality won out over contentment. They rose and dressed, moving around each other with new awareness, every accidental touch charged with meaning. Over breakfast, eggs and toast and coffee that Evelyn made while Jack watched like he'd never seen anyone cook before, they talked about ordinary things. The garden that needed watering, the supplies they were running low on, the way Mrs. Henderson's cat had been terrorizing the neighborhood chickens. It was domestic and mundane and absolutely perfect. But Jack knew that last night's drama wouldn't simply disappear. He'd made a choice in that moment on Main Street, but a single choice didn't erase years of habit and inclination. The pull of the cards wouldn't just vanish because he'd decided to be better. He'd have to prove it, day after day, choice after choice, until being Evelyn's husband became more natural than being a gambler had ever been. The test came sooner than he expected. Monday afternoon, Jack was repairing a fence post behind the house when Cyrus Blackwood rode up, sitting easy in his saddle despite his years. The old rancher dismounted with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent more time on horseback than on foot. "Jack," Cyrus greeted, his tone neutral, but his eyes assessing. "Got a minute?" "Sure," Jack said, setting down his hammer. "What can I do for you?" Cyrus looked at the fence, at the garden beyond, at the house with its repaired porch. "You've made a real home here," he observed. "Wasn't sure you had it in you, truth be told, but you've surprised me." "I've surprised myself," Jack admitted. "Heard about Saturday night," Cyrus said, getting to the point. "Heard you sat down at that table, played a few hands. Also heard you walked away, left your winnings, went after your wife." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "That took character. More than I gave you credit for when we made that bet." Jack waited, sensing there was more coming. Cyrus handed him the paper. "That's the deed to the Hartley Ranch. 200 acres, just like we wagered. I'm giving it to you. Jack stared at the paper like it might bite him. What? Why? I lost the bet. I married Evelyn. That was the price. You did, Cyrus agreed, and you paid it with more grace than any of us expected. You could have made that girl's life miserable, could have been cruel or neglectful or just absent in all the ways that matter. Instead, you became a husband, a real one. He pushed the deed toward Jack. This was always supposed to teach you a lesson about responsibility and commitment. Well, you've learned it. So take the land, build something on it, make it a legacy for the family you're starting. Jack's hand shook as he took the deed. 200 acres. The dream he'd gambled for and lost, now being given to him freely. I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it well, Cyrus said simply. Say you'll honor the lesson it cost to earn it. He climbed back on his horse, settling into the saddle. And Jack, that wife of yours is something special. You already know that, but I'm saying it anyway. Don't take her for granted. Not ever. I won't, Jack promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. After Cyrus rode off, Jack stood holding the deed, trying to process what had just happened. The thing he'd wanted most in the world, the prize that had led him into the worst mistake of his life, was now his. Not because he'd won it, but because he'd proven worthy of it through the slow, painful work of becoming a better man. He found Evelyn in the kitchen, working on mending. She looked up when he entered, and her expression shifted from mild curiosity to concern when she saw his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting down her sewing. "Nothing's wrong," Jack said, his voice strange even to his own ears. "Everything's right, that's the problem. It's all so right I don't know how to hold it." He showed her the deed, explained Cyrus's visit, watched understanding bloom across her features. "The Hartley Ranch," she said softly, taking the paper and studying it. 200 acres. That's what you wanted from the beginning, isn't it? What you bet everything for." "Yes," Jack admitted. "But I don't want it the same way anymore. Back then I wanted it for myself. Wanted to prove I was more than just a gambler. Wanted something permanent with my name on it. Now," he took her hands, the deed between them. "Now I want it for us, for the life we're building, for the children we might have someday, God willing. I want it to mean something beyond just owning land." Evelyn's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Children," she repeated, and there was wonder in her voice. "You think about that? About our future?" "All the time," Jack confessed. "I think about building a real house on that land, something solid that'll stand for generations. I think about you teaching our children to shoot and garden and be strong like you are. I think about growing old with you, Evelyn, and that future looks better than anything I ever imagined for myself." She kissed him then, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, she kept her forehead pressed to his and whispered, "Then let's build it. Let's take this gift we've been given, all of it, the land and the love and the second chances, and make something beautiful." They spent that evening making plans, sitting at their small kitchen table with the deed spread between them, talking about houses and cattle and crops. Evelyn had ideas Jack never would have considered, about water management and sustainable grazing, about which crops would thrive in the desert soil and which were fool's errands. She'd been reading, she admitted, borrowing books from the small library that Martha Brennan maintained in the church basement, preparing for a future she'd hoped for but hadn't dared to count on. "You really think we can do this?" Jack asked as the lamp burned low and night deepened around them. "Turn that empty land into something that matters?" "I think we can do anything," Evelyn said with quiet confidence. "Look what we've already done. We took a marriage that started as punishment and turned it into something real. We built a home out of nothing but stubbornness and hope. Why shouldn't we be able to build a ranch?" She was right, and Jack felt something settle in his chest. Not just love, though there was plenty of that, but purpose, direction, a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond just getting through the day. The next weeks blurred together in a flurry of activity. Jack gave notice at the livery, promising Dutch he'd help find a replacement before leaving. They sold the house on Cottonwood Lane to a young couple just starting out, passing on the same gifts Samuel Hart had given them. They bought supplies, lumber and tools and seed and everything else they'd need to start from scratch. Samuel Hart watched these preparations with an expression Jack couldn't quite read. One evening, he invited them both to supper at his small apartment above the general store. They ate simple food, stew and bread that Samuel had clearly struggled to prepare, and made awkward conversation until finally the older man set down his fork and looked at Jack directly. "I was wrong about you," Samuel said without preamble. "When this started, I thought you were trash. A worthless gambler who'd ruin my daughter's life and break her heart. I thought the best I could hope for was that you'd treat her decent and not beat her, or drink away whatever money she managed to earn." Jack felt Evelyn stiffen beside him, but Samuel held up a hand. "Let me finish," he said. "I was wrong. You're not trash. You're a man who made mistakes and owned them. A man who changed because change was needed. A man who loves my daughter the way she deserves to be loved, not in spite of who she is, but because of it." His voice roughened. "You've given her something I couldn't. You've given her a future, a partnership, a chance to be more than just Samuel Hart's quiet daughter. And for that, I'm grateful." Evelyn's hand found Jack's under the table, squeezing tightly. "Papa?" "I'm also sorry," Samuel continued. "Sorry I didn't see her strength before you came along. Sorry I let her hide in my store in my shadow instead of pushing her to find her own way. Sorry I was so busy being angry about the bet that I didn't see you two were actually building something worth having." He stood, crossed to them, and offered Jack his hand. "Welcome to the family, son. For real this time." Jack shook his father-in-law's hand, feeling the weight of acceptance settle on his shoulders. They talked late into the night, Samuel sharing stories about Evelyn's mother, about the early days in Coyote Ridge, about his own mistakes and regrets. By the time they walked home under a sky full of stars, Jack felt like he'd been given something precious. Not just acceptance, but belonging. "He really means it," Evelyn said wonderingly. "He approves of you, of us." "Sounds like it," Jack agreed, his arm around her shoulders as they walked. "Think he'll come visit us at the ranch once we're settled?" "I think he'd like that," Evelyn said. "I think he'd like it very much." They moved to the Hartley Ranch on a bright morning in late September, when the worst of the summer heat had finally broken. Their belongings fit in a single wagon, a humbling reminder of how little they had in material terms. But Jack looked at Evelyn sitting beside him on the wagon seat, the deed to 200 acres tucked safely in his pocket, and felt richer than any card game had ever made him. The land was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Rolling hills covered in scrub brush and desert grass, broken by outcroppings of red rock and stands of juniper. The 3 natural springs Cyrus had mentioned formed small pools that attracted wildlife and supported surprising patches of green. It was raw and wild and full of possibility. "There," Evelyn said, pointing to a slight rise that overlooked the largest spring. "That's where we should build the house, high enough to catch the breeze, close enough to water, with a view of the whole property." Jack could see it. Not just the house as it would be, but their whole life spreading out before them. Children playing in the yard, cattle grazing the hills, fields of crops they'd coax from the reluctant soil. Years and decades of work and love and building something that would outlast them both. "Perfect," he said, and meant it in every possible way. They lived in a tent for the first month while Jack built a cabin. It wasn't fancy, just one room with a loft, a fireplace that smoked when the wind shifted wrong, and windows that didn't quite fit their frames. But Evelyn made it a home with curtains sewn from fabric scraps and furniture salvaged from the old Hartley buildings. She planted a garden 3 times the size of the one they'd had on Cottonwood Lane, her hands in the soil every day, coaxing life from the desert. Jack worked until his body ached and his hands bled, building fences and repairing the old barn and learning everything he could about running a ranch. The Patterson brothers helped, teaching him about cattle and grazing rotation and which parts of his land were best for what purposes. Cyrus Blackwood stopped by regularly, offering advice and criticism in equal measure, always leaving Jack with something new to think about. It was the hardest work Jack had ever done. Harder than gambling, harder than anything he'd attempted before. Some mornings he woke before dawn, looked at the endless list of tasks ahead of him, and felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they'd taken on. But then Evelyn would stir beside him, still half asleep, and press a kiss to his shoulder before rising to start her own day. And Jack would remember why he was doing this. Not for land or legacy or even redemption. For her. For them. For the life they were building together, one choice at a time. 3 months after moving to the ranch, Jack made a trip back to Coyote Ridge for supplies. He timed it carefully, arriving in the morning and planning to leave by afternoon, minimizing his time in town. Not because he didn't trust himself anymore, but because the ranch needed him, and he didn't want to waste time. Still, his route took him past the Lucky Dollar Saloon. He slowed despite himself, old habits pulling at him. Through the window, he could see men at the tables, the familiar scene of cards and chips, and the promise of that old thrill. For a moment, just a moment, he let himself remember what it felt like. The rush of a winning hand, the respect in other players' eyes when he made a brilliant play, the simplicity of a world where everything came down to luck and skill and reading the odds. Then he thought of Evelyn, probably working in the garden right now, her hands in the soil, building something that would last. He thought of the cabin they'd built together, imperfect but sturdy. He thought of the life they were creating, difficult and uncertain, but utterly real. The pull of the cards faded, replaced by something stronger. Not temptation conquered, but choice affirmed. He didn't walk away from the saloon because he had to. He walked away because he wanted to, because what waited for him at home was infinitely more valuable than anything he could win at those tables. He finished his shopping, loaded the wagon, and started the drive back to the ranch. The sun was setting by the time he arrived, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Evelyn was waiting on the porch of their small cabin, and when she saw him, her face lit up with a smile that made every hard choice, every moment of doubt, completely worthwhile. "Welcome home," she said as he climbed down from the wagon. "It's good to be home," Jack replied, and realized he'd never meant anything more in his life. That night, after supper, and after they'd unloaded the supplies together, they sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Evelyn leaned against Jack's shoulder, his arm around her, both of them tired but content. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "The bet? The marriage? All of it?" Jack considered the question seriously. Did he regret the arrogance that had led him to that table? The stupidity of the wager? The 3 months of stubbornness and missed opportunities? "I regret that it took me so long to see what was right in front of me," he said finally. "I regret wasting time being miserable when I could have been getting to know you. I regret the hurt I caused you with my selfishness." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "But regret the bet itself? Regret that it brought us together? No, never." "Good," Evelyn said, "because I have something to tell you, and I want you to be happy about it." Jack pulled back to look at her, recognizing something in her tone. "What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, her gray eyes bright with emotion. "We're going to have a baby, Jack. Due sometime in the spring, the doctor in Tucson thinks." The world stopped. Just completely stopped. Every sound and sensation fading except for Evelyn's face and the weight of her hand over his on her stomach. A baby. Their baby. A child who would be born free of the mistakes that had brought them together, who would only know parents who loved each other and the land they'd built their life on. "Are you sure?" Jack asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Very sure," Evelyn confirmed. "I've known for a few weeks, but I wanted to wait until we were more settled, until I was certain you were happy here, that you wouldn't resent another tie binding you down." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her as carefully as if she were made of spun glass. "Resent?" He managed around the lump in his throat. "Evelyn, I don't even have words. This is everything. You're everything." She laughed, the sound muffled against his shoulder. "You're going to be a father, Jack Merritt. Are you ready for that?" "Probably not," he admitted. "But I wasn't ready to be a husband either, and you've taught me how to do that. I figure we'll learn this together too." They stayed on the porch until the cold drove them inside, talking about names and preparations and all the ways their life was about to change again. Jack felt something close to fear. He'd never been a father before, didn't know the first thing about raising a child, but underneath the fear was excitement and hope and a bone-deep certainty that they could handle whatever came next. Winter came to the desert, cold nights and crisp days and occasional snow that melted by noon. Jack spent his time building a proper cradle in the barn, working the wood with careful attention, wanting everything to be perfect. Evelyn knitted tiny clothes and prepared the cabin, her body changing slowly as their child grew inside her.
they had their difficulties. Money was tight until they could sell their first cattle.
The work was relentless, never quite done no matter how many hours they put in. There were nights when Jack fell into bed so exhausted he couldn't move, and mornings when Evelyn was sick and couldn't eat, when the pregnancy was harder than either of them had anticipated. But they faced it together. When Jack doubted himself, Evelyn steadied him. When Evelyn struggled, Jack supported her. They'd learned how to be partners, how to lean on each other, how to build something bigger than either of them could manage alone. Spring arrived with wildflowers and the birth of their daughter on a warm April morning. Martha Brennan served as midwife, traveling all the way from Coyote Ridge to help. Samuel Hart paced outside the cabin, as nervous as Jack had ever seen him, and Jack held Evelyn's hand through every contraction and push, marveling at her strength even as he felt utterly useless. When their daughter finally arrived, red-faced and screaming her outrage at the world, Jack cried without shame. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a shock of dark hair, and her mother's gray eyes. Evelyn held her with exhausted wonder, and when she looked up at Jack, there was so much love in her expression that it physically hurt. "What should we name her?" Evelyn asked. Jack thought about the journey that had brought them here, the card game that had seemed like the end of everything but had actually been the beginning, the quiet woman who'd hidden fire beneath silence, the wild kiss that had changed everything. "Grace," he said, "because we were given grace we didn't earn, because that's what brought us through." "Grace Merritt," Evelyn tested, smiling. "I like it." Samuel Hart held his granddaughter with shaking hands, tears streaming down his weathered face. Martha Brennan clucked approvingly and declared her the finest baby born in the territory. The Patterson brothers sent a calf as a gift. Cyrus Blackwood arrived with a rifle, for when she's old enough to learn, like her mother, and gruff congratulations. The whole town of Coyote Ridge, it seemed, celebrated the arrival of Jack and Evelyn's daughter. The couple no one had expected to last, the marriage that started as a punishment, had produced new life and new hope. That summer, Jack rode into Coyote Ridge one last time on business. He needed to file papers at the territory office, update their brand registration, handle the administrative details of being a rancher. It was a hot afternoon when he finished, and without really meaning to, he found himself standing outside the Lucky Dollar Saloon. The doors were propped open to catch any breeze, and he could hear the familiar sounds, men talking, glasses clinking, cards shuffling. He stood there for a long moment, testing himself, seeing if the old pull was still there. It wasn't. Or rather, it was, but it felt distant now, like something that had happened to a different person in a different life. The man who'd sat at those tables, who'd defined himself by his ability to read cards and calculate odds, was gone. In his place was a husband and father, a rancher learning his trade, a man building something that mattered. Sal Murphy emerged from the saloon, stopping short when he saw Jack. For a moment they just looked at each other. Then Sal smiled. "You gonna come in?" Sal asked. "No," Jack said, and the word felt like liberation. "No, I'm not. I just wanted to see if I could stand here and not want it anymore. Turns out I can." Sal nodded slowly. "Heard about your daughter. Congratulations." "Thank you," Jack said. "She's perfect. They both are." "You did good, Jack," Sal said seriously. "Better than anyone thought you could. You should be proud." "I'm grateful," Jack corrected. "There's a difference." He turned and walked away from the Lucky Dollar for the final time, climbed on his horse, and started the ride back to the ranch, to his wife and daughter, to the life he'd built from the ashes of his old one. The sun was setting as he arrived home, the sky painted in the brilliant colors the desert did better than anywhere else. Evelyn was on the porch with Grace in her arms, and when she saw him, she stood and waved. Jack waved back, urging his horse faster, eager to be home. As he dismounted and climbed the porch steps, Evelyn smiled at him with her whole heart, no longer guarded or careful, just open and loving and his. "Welcome back," she said. "It's good to be back," Jack replied, kissing her softly before taking his daughter into his arms. Grace looked up at him with solemn gray eyes, and Jack's heart swelled almost painfully. "Did you finish your business?" Evelyn asked. "I did," Jack confirmed. "And I did something else. I walked past the saloon, stood outside it, and realized I didn't want anything it had to offer anymore. Everything I want is right here. Evelyn's eyes shone with understanding and pride. I know, she said simply. I've known for a while. They went inside together as darkness fell, the small cabin warm with lamplight and love. Later, after Grace was asleep in her cradle and they'd eaten supper and washed the dishes side by side, Jack and Evelyn sat together in the rocking chair Samuel had made for his granddaughter Evelyn in Jack's lap, both of them watching the baby sleep. Do you remember what I said that night? Evelyn asked softly. About your wild kiss setting my soul on fire? I remember, Jack said. Changed everything. It wasn't just your kiss, Evelyn said. It was what it represented. You choosing me over your fear, choosing us over everything you'd been before. That's what set me free, Jack. Not the kiss itself, but what it meant. Jack held her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling Grace's steady breathing in the cradle beside them. You set me free too, he said. From being a gambler who didn't care about anything beyond the next win. From being a man with no purpose, no future, nothing that mattered. You gave me all of this, a home, a family, a reason to be better than I ever thought I could be. We gave it to each other, Evelyn corrected. That's how love works. Years later, when people told the story, and they told it often because Coyote Ridge loved its legends, they'd call it the tale of the gambler and the quiet girl. They'd talk about the bet that changed a life, about the woman who could shoot a hat off a man's head, about the fire they fought together, and the wild kiss that changed everything. But Jack Merritt knew the truth. It wasn't one kiss or one moment that had saved him. It was 1,000 small choices, 1,000 quiet moments, 1,000 times he'd chosen her and she'd chosen him right back. It was waking up beside her every morning and choosing to be the man she deserved. It was watching her tend their garden and raise their daughter and build their life with steady determination. It was learning that love wasn't a winning hand or a lucky draw, but patient work and daily commitment and showing up even when it was hard. The wild kiss hadn't tamed him. It had set him free, free from the shallow life he'd been leading, free to become someone who mattered, free to love and be loved in return. And that freedom, hard-won and carefully tended, was worth more than any pot he'd ever won at cards. Grace grew up strong and steady like her mother, with her father's quick smile and sharp mind. She learned to shoot before she could properly read, learned to work the land with reverent determination, learned that the best things in life weren't won, but built with patience and love. Other children followed, 2 sons who kept the ranch running well into the next century, carrying on the legacy their parents had forged from nothing but stubbornness and hope. The Merritt Ranch became known throughout the territory, not because it was the biggest or richest, but because it stood for something. Second chances. Redemption. The possibility that people could change if they wanted it badly enough and had someone willing to believe in them. Jack never gambled again. Never once sat down at a card table after that final walk past the lucky dollar. He didn't need to. He'd already won the only game that mattered, and the prize, Evelyn, their children, the life they built together, was beyond anything he could have imagined when he sat down at that fateful table so many years ago.